accessories. Some of it might be, but most of it isn't.
So are you a strong I love going to the
I do that. I've been on 80 clip strips.
You have 80?
Eight. Not 80. No, not
Oh,
80.
I think I've been on more. But where did you go?
Um, all right, in order, I've been to Mexico,
Where in Mexico?
the Caribbean, and Black Sea, South Africa, um, we saw the eclipse from the Strait, what's it called? Madagascar, between the mainland and Madagascar. Yeah. Oh yeah, I've done a lot of shipping. No, no, that's the whole point is you can move. And if I hadn't been on a ship, I would have missed one of the eclipses. It's part of the fun of going after eclipses. Where else? Okay, I stopped with Africa, right? South Pacific, Libya. Libya was really cool. We were there between the time we started planning the trip and the time we went. Libya opened some United States senators. So, we were among the first Western tourists to Oh yeah, yeah. It's tremendous ruins and things like that. And they're totally untouched. You walk in, there's no guards or anything. Run your fingers through inscriptions and stuff. Because it's not things that everything is just there. And we were out in the desert, and it was really interesting. All the locals came to see the ships too. And so there were all these foreign tourists around the desert, and we were ringed by thousands of them. And then they were all driving so cars. And the high Arctic and South Pacific again. Have some pretty cool stuff. Last one was called the Cook Islands. And we were on a ship, and we had to move like crazy throughout the
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the forum. And I want to thank our sponsors, the Shorenstein Center tonight and the Institute of Politics, for hosting this gathering. The title of tonight's discussion among the panel here is The Future of News, which is a non-judgmental kind of a statement. We're not really saying whether it's heading in a good direction or a bad direction, but I think it's probably fair to say, and everyone in the room knows, that in the context in which we're holding this session is that it's difficult not to feel like we've come here to sit in mourning for something that we've all loved for many years. Just think for a moment, some developments from the last week alone. Forbes magazine announced that it's cutting 1/4 of its staff. The Wall Street Journal announced that it's closing its Boston bureau, which some people have argued is responsible for more page-one stories than any other domestic bureau outside of New York or Washington, D.C. The New York Times announced it's cutting 100 newsroom jobs by the end of next month, actually, nearly 10% of its staff. Business Week, like some broken-down horse, is being sold off for its glue. Gourmet is no longer the magazine, and Time Inc. is planning to lay off 540 employees to save $100 million. Rick Edmonds, who's a researcher, scholar with the Poynter Institute, he's estimating that just within the last couple of years, the news media has stopped spending or has not spent $1.6 billion on journalism that it had been spending up until this point. And that was just really this week that all of this has happened. So what does this mean? Well, Henry Jenkins of MIT, who I think is this generation's Marshall McLuhan, he recently said, "We're living through a shift in the communications environment on a scale that has only occurred a few times in human history, comparable to the shift from an oral tradition to literacy, the emergence of print, and the rise of modern mass media." And unlike those other periods, what is taking place now is happening in a relative nanosecond in terms of human history. So Jenkins went on to say, "It's happening much faster than most of the population can grasp their implications. The result is periodic bursts of moral panic and lightly scattered euphoria." In any event, here to help us work our way through these periods of panic and euphoria, if there is much of that, it's a terrific panel. And I'm going to introduce them. Starting from my left is Marty Barron. Martin Barron, many of you I'm sure know that Marty is the editor of the Boston Globe. He actually was my predecessor as executive editor at the Miami Herald before he fled what he thought were greener pastures when he came to Boston in 2001. He also is highly regarded in the profession. He has twice been named the editor of the year by Editor and Publisher magazine, and he's responsible for the Pulitzer Prizes at both the Miami Herald and at the Boston Globe. So please welcome Marty Barron. To Marty's left is Robin Sproul. Robin is the bureau chief of ABC News Washington Bureau, responsible for all of their domestic coverage, their political coverage, and of course in Washington, D.C. She's been there, 30 years now, come up through ABC, been there, started with radio and shifted over to take over that bureau several years ago. She was a Shorenstein Fellow in 2007, 2008, and did her research into the impact of public opinion polling in the presidential campaigns. So please welcome Robin Sproul. And then Jeff Howe. Jeff is a Neiman Fellow this year and is a contributing editor at Wired magazine. Actually, he describes himself as a print guy, starting with, did you say the Columbus?
Columbus Dispatch.
Columbus Dispatch. But also was with U.S. News and World Report, has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, many other publications, most recently for the Village Voice. But you may know, if not him, what he's done, you may know a word that he is responsible for coining. We'll talk a bit about that tonight. The word crowdsourcing, which has, I think, become part of our vocabulary over, really, it's in a surprising amount of time. So we'll discuss about what crowdsourcing may be doing and how that may tie in with where we're going in the future of news. So please welcome Jeff Howe. And finally, on the far left, someone that most of you already know, but it's my pleasure to introduce Alex Jones. Alex is the director of the Shorenstein Center, but he also is a distinguished journalist, a longtime reporter for the New York Times, and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the story of the Sulzberger family called The Trust that he did with his wife Susan. And also something that maybe not as many people know is that he is the fourth generation in his family to actually own and operate newspapers. So he not only writes about them, studies them, and has been a distinguished journalist but he has been an owner and is an owner of a newspaper in Greenville, Tennessee. So most important, and I think the reason that we're really here tonight is because of Alex's new book, Losing the News here. The subtitle, The Future of the News That Feeds Democracy. So please welcome Alex Jones. And I'm going to start with Alex. It's only appropriate. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists to respond to questions, but then I would hope each of you would also feel free to respond to the responses. So we'll start the conversation that way. But initially, Alex, on Losing the News, what really are you talking about when you say that what is the real threat? What is at most danger of being lost that you see with the changes?
The thing that I start with is exactly what you just described about what's happened in the past week, which is the erosion of the resources and the ability to cover what I call the iron core of news. And I don't mean by that cover it verbally with hot air. I mean with serious reported news on serious topics, ranging from City Hall and the State House to Afghanistan and what's going on in the White House, policy questions and that kind of thing. I think that the image that I came up with that suggested what's happening to me was of a kind of a pitted iron cannonball that is not a perfect sphere and certainly far from perfect in its composition, but that represents all of the cumulative reporting of this kind that is done by news organizations throughout the United States every day. Most of that, the vast majority of that, has been done by newspapers. As newspapers especially have had this very difficult experience of the economic model being blown up and moving into the digital world, and now this economic turmoil that has really hammered the newspaper business, the resources for covering that news and the ability and the will to cover that news has been eroded. But the book goes beyond that, because what I argue in the book is that also in play are many of the things that have made American journalism singular and very important by my lights to what we think of as our national conversation. By that I mean the standard of objectivity. I mean the code of journalism ethics and the idea that journalism ethics are an important part of what journalists do, which I sincerely believe. It means the erosion of the ability institutionally to support the First Amendment, because as I talk about in the book, the reality is that the First Amendment freedoms that we take for granted now, for instance, the ability to complain and oppose a war, are something that did not exist until relatively recently, very recently actually. You could go to jail for opposing World War I, and people did. And in addition to that is something that I feel is a very damaging potential wound to our national fabric, which is that these institutions of newspapers and other mainstream news media are going to be, if they disappear, are going to create a terrible vacuum in our communities, because these institutions have been the fund of power for making good journalism have an impact. A perfect example of that is something many of you who live in Boston will remember. A few years ago, one of the Sunday mornings I'll never forget, when the Boston Globe arrived on my doorstep and the whole top of the front page was covered with a Boston Globe story about
how the Catholic Church in Boston had been protecting pedophiles. And they were repeat pedophiles who were moved from church to church and so forth. This was something that was a profoundly disturbing story, and it was told with great detail and great authority. It was also told at the instigation of Marty Barron. It won a Pulitzer Prize. The thing that was singular about that story was, first of all, on the first day, the sole participation of the Catholic Church was no comment. But they could not remain silent. The institution of the church could not remain silent in the face of the onslaught of this institutional power that the Boston Globe represents in New England. But the thing that's also interesting is that a significant amount of what was reported that day had already been reported. It had been reported in part, in piecemeal, but there nonetheless in the Boston Phoenix. But it had not mattered. The Catholic Church had blown it off. They could not blow off the Boston Globe. That, I think, is the kind of thing that is in danger as these institutions are put in great financial jeopardy, and as they also change their willingness to commit themselves to the public good that has been part of the mainstream media, and especially newspapers, culture since the 19th century, which is that they were businesses, but they had a public mission, and that public mission was realized through reporting serious news. That's something that I think in these perilous times newspapers may well be backing away from and may be becoming more like much of local television news, which basically does not touch any of these kinds of iron core issues. I think that the point of my book is to tell people that this is happening and to explain why it's important, and then to also, I hope, offer some ideas about how it might not happen, because it's called losing the news, not lost, because I do believe that that news does have a future. It must have a future, because the cost to our country would be profound if it did not.
I want to come back to later what you said about that the globe was too big for the Catholic Church to blow off with there, and maybe discuss that more. But let me come back, let me ask you, Marty, what is different at the Boston Globe today than it was, if anything, when the Globe did that series of stories? Do you feel something is being lost there?
Well, what's different is that, we retain our sense of mission, and the same mission that we had when we did that set of stories. And it was probably 1,000 stories in the first year, and it cost us probably over $1 million to do all of that work. But today, our staff is 30% smaller than it was, and our budget is 30% smaller than it was. And we, like every other newspaper and pretty much every other news organization, even the broadcast media, are faced with continuing financial pressures. And so we have to make tougher choices. Now, our choice has been to continue to dedicate ourselves to covering this community and to give up some of the things that we used to do. So that is foreign coverage and coverage of national news outside of Washington and some other things. But we have retained pretty much our resources in covering this community, and we have retained our investigative resources as well. And so we've continued to do investigations just in the last year on disability abuse by government employees and by firefighters in particular, pension abuse by all sorts of government employees, an investigation of Sal DeMacy, the Speaker of the House, that now has him facing a criminal indictment. So we're very much committed to that, but we continue to face financial pressures, and over time, that can have an impact on the kinds of reporting that we can do.
Could you have done a story as ambitious as the taking on the pedophile priests? Would you do that today?
We would do it today, but we would make greater sacrifices today in order to accomplish that. We had a larger spotlight team then. We had a larger Metro staff then. We could spare more people to work on a story of that nature. And in pursuing a story of that sort, we didn't have to give as much up of the other coverage. And now we would have to make a tougher choice. We would have to choose not to cover other things in this community.
Robin, you have also been seeing significant changes in network television over time. The market for evening news has diminished significantly, probably at least as quickly as we've seen newspaper circulation drop. I saw you recently made the point that your audience now tends to be over 60 baby boomers. So what do you see network television doing when it comes to being able to carry on the news tradition?
I'll agree with Marty in that we go through a process too of making choices and figuring out how we can make usage of the technology in very creative ways to shrink and pour the resources we have into things that will make us distinctive. And I think that sort of approach to differentiation has helped us we have a bigger investigative team now than we did years ago. We have fewer people overseas than we did years ago. We pool more with other television organizations all around the world. We try not to spend parallel money on commodity news or video. If it's video that everybody's going to get, we'll share it and then try and pour the resources we have into something that makes us distinctive. We've invested a lot in our website and moving video onto there, and we run the whole politics part of that out of Washington. So we're focusing more in areas that we believe in the future we can make a difference, and we've reorganized to grow units toward medicine and health, law and justice, politics, investigative reporting in a way that differentiates us a little bit for the future, in a way that we were more of a general, maybe Iron Core news division. We're not abandoning the Iron Core principles, and we're certainly covering hard news and really the news of the day from all over the world every day, but we're trying to be stewards of the resources in a way that will really have a higher impact in the future.
Now, how are you addressing, though, the aging audience? How do you reach out to the younger demographic?
Well, I think we're not changing the type of news we do, but we're just trying to reach, it used to be you go find the news, now the news needs to go find you, and I think what we're trying to do is go find those people, and we're doing pretty well with our iPhone application for ABC News and trying to be on all sorts of platforms, and to cover all kinds of different stories online and to reach people that way. And the video is a big draw. I mean, that's something we do very well, and that continues to be a big draw for younger people. But our television programs, over time, the age has gone up, and it continues to go up, and the audiences are going down. So we are migrating to more of converged on our online and television programs.
I want to come to you, Jeff, but I want to ask Alex another question first, and it really gets back to this about having a news organization that is so big you've got to pay attention to it. Doesn't the web fill that void? You can reach so many places at once with the web.
I don't think that the power of the Boston Globe that I'm talking about had to do with paper and ink. It had to do with the institutional power of the Boston Globe to reach that audience. And I think, of course, in the future, now, I mean, the digital future is here. There's no arguing about it. That's definitely going to be there. But I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that if an institution committed to this public good of serious journalism, and with a recognition and a brand name and a reach that can have that kind of impact, disappears, then the power of that community to sort of coalesce and respond to a profoundly important story, I think, is greatly diminished. I think the point I'm trying to make is made by the fact that the Boston Phoenix was not able to get the traction with the Catholic Church. I think that the Boston Globe would have gotten the traction the web was there when this happened, and that amplified, in fact, what the Boston Globe put on its front page. But the point was that the institutional power of the Boston Globe was very important, and a lot of startup, news organizations online, for instance, they draw their power. They have the institutional power when they have it for the very good journalism that many of them are doing, when their work migrates to this dominant news organization in a particular community. And if you take that out, I mean, I know that there is one theory of covering Boston in the future. We'll have, many, many news sites, and one will cover Central Square, and one will cover Somerville, and so forth. I don't think that will work very well. I think that will be an invitation to a lot of bad things, because I think the watchdog role, the power of delivering powerful journalism in a way that can have an impact, will be greatly diminished. By the same token, I think the Boston Globe, I hope it survives, and I believe it will be fed by many of these news organizations and these other entities, by your own investigative unit at BU, for instance. And it will be, the mechanism for delivering that news that it generates and that others do. But if you lose that institutional power, I think you've really lost something very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, did you want to comment on that?
Just very quickly, because Jeff should say something here, but I don't think it was just the fact of it being the Boston Globe and the size of the Boston Globe. I think it was the fact of 8 months of reporting that went into the first story that while the Phoenix had done good work, they went well beyond what had previously been done. And on top of that, actually having an institution that had the financial resources and the courage, I think, to go to court, to file a motion in court against probably the most powerful institution in this community, the Roman Catholic Church, and seek to unseal documents that had been sealed during a course of a long period of litigation, and obtain documents that had been secret within the Catholic Church for 40 years. And so I think that was really the power of the Boston Globe's reporting, even more so than simply the strength of the institution.
Don't misunderstand me. I don't think there's any question that the quality of the journalism was the most important thing. But the delivery system from this institution gave it an authority that the reporting also had. But that was the delivery system that I believe meant that the Catholic Church could not ignore.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, you have written mostly about businesses, about the ability of relatively small businesses to have a huge impact, far disproportionate to their size, by taking advantage of the new technology, which gets to the word. First of all, if you would explain what crowdsourcing means, maybe how that came to be, and then put it in a journalistic context. Can you put it in a journalistic context?
Yeah, pretty easily. So we came up with the term crowdsourcing, my editor and I, actually looking at a number of examples. Probably the best one was stock photography. And the situation in stock photography was that an entrepreneur had started a site really as a gift to his community. I mean, it wasn't even meant as a hobby, where he'd put his own photographs up and allowed people to download them for free, so long as they posted their own photographs. Eventually, it became he couldn't afford the hosting cost, to pay for all the servers that this required. So he started charging a quarter for this. And so what happened is this slew of amateur photographers became competitive to the stock photography industry, which at the time the average price of a stock photo was $250 to $300. So suddenly they had undercut it, by more than 99%. It become a quarter. Now it's like $1. So we looked at this and in the context of user-generated content, and felt that people were missing the boat by focusing on the content part of that equation, that there needed to be some term that captured both the breadth of the phenomenon, but also the aspect that this posed a threat to people's jobs, to entire industries. It has, since the article came out, coining the word, wreaked havoc in the stock photo industry, for example. At the time, I wanted to include journalism, and so naturally looked for examples in which newspapers, magazines, broadcast outlets were incorporating their readers, their audience, into the production process. But there really wasn't much, except interestingly a little bit in sports journalism, where you have rabid fans that often possess a great deal of expertise. But it wasn't enough to go into the article. Actually, what happened is some Gannett executives were reading the article some 4 or 5 months later in the midst of a big reinvention of all their newsrooms and applied this term to what they were doing. One of the planks of this reinvention became this crowdsourcing program, and thus this term became applied to what is otherwise known as citizen journalism or reader-generated news. I mean, you can use any manner of terms, and for all intents and concerns, they're synonymous.
Is there any argument that you could make that by turning to the power of the crowd, so to speak, that you can replace what is lost as the iron core, as to use Alex's phrase, begins to shrink? Can the crowd step up and replace some of that?
No. I mean, no. I mean, they can.
We're done.
Yeah. No. I mean, believe me, I could go on and on about exactly why not, to the extent that it can. But I definitely want to lead with the definitive no. It cannot at this present time. The audience does not have a deep network of sources. They do not have the capacity, the understanding of how to file a FOIA request, or at least very few of them do. But what I would say is that, on the other side of that, a lot of people, in looking at how a lot of citizen journalism efforts have failed, and a lot have, in fact, the majority have. Some have been sparkling successes, and that's the reason why so many papers, continue to try to solicit content from their audiences, is because they're looking at those successes. But the assumption looking at the failures is that where the audience is now is where they always will be, and that's in terms of their proficiency, their understanding of simply their understanding of grammar. I mean, what it means to communicate with a broad audience. If you look at the quality of an average blog post 5 years ago and now, it's changed dramatically. If you look at what Wikipedia was 2 years ago, I mean, it was amateurish and erroneous. So now people have decided that is the status quo, but Wikipedia has already changed dramatically. So there's a great process of professionalization going on in the amateur quadrant, or whatever you want to call it. And I mean, a great example is what Le Monde is doing right now. They have a whole division for user-generated news. And the idea is to begin incorporating it into Le Monde. I mean, eventually, they won't call it citizen journalism or crowdsourcing. The term will drop away. It'll just be part of making the news. And they're getting 2.5 million unique hits, unique visitors a month through much more of a hybrid model where they're training these people who, for whatever reason, maybe they're aspiring journalists themselves, maybe they're retired and have always wanted to contribute to the news, but for whatever reason want to contribute to the news-making process and are capable of it under guidance.
Robin?
Well, just to pick up on what you're talking about, Jeff, I mean, there's no doubt in broadcast news that the day of the anchor person sitting in the chair and telling you the news, and by the way, don't call us because we're so much smarter than you are, that died well before a financial crisis came along, and people have been angry at the news media for a long time in polls, and that's something we've been talking about. I think that as we look toward a future, there's no doubt that the future is an inclusive one involving conversations with and an inclusion of your audience and citizen journalisms and the give and take of a news organization. But still, I think as people look for news, the whole issue of trust and who's going to edit news, the financial part of it will settle down, and there will be sites that people recognize as a place where you will get the truth, you will get the iron core of news, you will get excellence in reporting, you will get editing. These will be the major news organizations that will live out there and will be one of the 16 to 20 sites you go to every day or every week to check your news. The founder of Craigslist said this week, and I love this, he said that trust is the new black. And I think that's something that we can all, I sort of believe that. And I think this will settle down, and there will have to be places people go for trusted information. And I think to be a part of that, you will, in this sort of curation of these news sites, have to involve people in a way that we didn't before, and we do already. And that's very interesting what Le Monde is doing, and I think all of us are experimenting with things like that.
I think what Jeff's reference to Wikipedia is very instructive, because I think what Wikipedia did was to become very much more careful about who it gave access to and how it sort of regulated what it put up as the Wikipedia version of whatever the subject was. And I think that one of the great things about the web is that you're going to be able to identify, a host of new expertise and all. But if it's unvetted, if it's unregulated, if it's uncontrolled and edited, then I think it's going to be like, another website, which is based on the philosophy of putting up absolutely anything and letting the crowd, if you will, decide whether it's true or not, and effectively let that be the fact-checking mechanism. I don't think that belongs as part of journalism. I don't recognize that as part of journalism. I do recognize as part of journalism the idea that there would be a broad group of people who would be able to offer expertise that would be part of a trusted brand's message about what the truth is.
Let me just ask Marty, how do you react when you hear the phrase citizen journalism? How do you define that?
Well, I don't necessarily consider it to be journalism as such, because with journalism, it's people with information who are supplying information, or they're supplying something that has come to be called content, a word that I despise. But it's a photograph, or one fact, or an opinion, or something like that. And journalism is more than that. Journalism is sending professionals out to, for the most part, professionals, out to find out what's going on, to talk to people, to look at documents, to verify those documents, to assure yourself that you're being fair, you're being honest, you're being accurate, and then you put it in a form, you write it, or you broadcast it in a form that it's accessible to a large group of people and they can understand what you're talking about. And for the most part, that doesn't happen with user-generated content or crowdsourcing or so-called citizen journalism. One of the reasons why, that hasn't been mentioned actually, why some news organizations are so much in favor of citizen journalism has nothing whatsoever to do with the idea of being more inclusive, which is one of the reasons. But there's another reason, and that is that it's free and it's cheap. And so at many news organizations, people on the business side see that as an opportunity to replace professionals who actually cost money. And they say, well, gee, if there are people out there, bloggers, who in their spare time are covering the news, then why don't we take that? Why do we have to pay somebody to do it ourselves? And the reality is that what they're getting from bloggers and others is not what they're paying professionals to do. And it is not a perfect substitute. It's not even a good substitute. And it's a dangerous route to travel if what you're trying to do is replace journalism that costs something and that's professionally produced with so-called citizen journalism. It's not that it's a bad thing to have. It's not that it can't be useful as part of what we do. It can be. In fact, it can be very useful, and it's a good thing to have. And we should be more inclusive. But it is not a substitute for what we're doing. It is a supplement to what we're doing.
Robin, how do you use contributions from citizen journalists?
We don't use them in place of reporters or correspondents, but when I'm really talking about a more inclusive process in which somebody comes to a website or an ABC, put the television part aside, our website, and talks to Brian Ross's investigative unit and comments on that and gives him tips and shares emails they maybe got from a congressman in a way that's a much more of a two-way street. And it is an experience of news that involves people, involves your audience or your users or your readers more than we did in the past. And I think that has been a step forward. And I think it makes it much more of an invigorating and healthy process. It doesn't mean that we use them in place of reporters or don't edit the information. I mean, we get lots of information from people who come to our site that never goes anywhere else because we can't verify it. But it's part of sort of we are maybe the curators, as that word is used a lot now, of a journalism site that involves people in a much different way than we used to.
Jeff, do you see, is there a way that the crowd can more or less police itself so that it can deal with the malevolent voice out there, or the ignorant voice that seems to come out there?
Yeah, sure. It already is. I mean, I think, to Alex's point of being uneasy at the idea of having the crowd vet journalism. I mean, this is how online news sites already work. Is it's post first and correct later. And that's, I mean, now, and you can, I mean, and whether or not that ethos is commendable or not, I mean, it is efficient. And reader conventions have begun to shift so that when someone reads something online, they are on one hand, more less surprised to see a mistake because they know that they can correct it quickly. Because there's a place right under the article where they can put something. And I think that to a large extent that the discourse that's emerged around, especially reader comments on news sites, a lot of that is a programming fix. It's something that we call it us geeks call the slash dot model, which is simply having the crowd moderate comments, and the crowd will generally vote down. Just a simple thumbs up, thumbs down will vote down the trolls. I mean, no one wants to read what a 13-year-old kid's idea of profane humor is. And so, that'll quickly get voted down to the bottom. Now, not all news sites, in fact, probably most news sites haven't implemented this, but that's a programming issue in-house for them.
It seems terribly inefficient if you have to read through all the comments of commenting until you get to something which is...
Because in the process of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people reading it, it evolves. The comments evolve. So that, ones that are viewed as substantive and to the point get voted up. Now, this is an ideal world. I mean, it doesn't always work like that. And the same 13-year-old can go and vote all the bad comments up, and that's sometimes happened. But, I think that as a provisional fix in an evolving system,
I just have the image of you have to sit in front of your screen all day long in order to keep up with this, whereas you can go to a news site or newspaper or television news program that has integrity, and you get that without having to go through all that other stuff.
But you use both. I mean, as soon as a Buckeye game is over, my dad taught at Ohio State. I grew up watching Buckeye games. I go and I read what ESPN has to say. I read what Tim May at the Columbus Dispatch, who I worked with. He's a wonderful, astute commentator on Buckeye football, and then immediately I go down and see what the readers have to say, because the readers are, as a rule, much more. I mean, they actually talk about why the offensive coordinator made, called a certain call, in the third play in the third quarter. I mean, it's much more detailed. It's strictly for rabid fans. I mean, I think that it's a complex ecosystem. And we go to Huffington Post for some things, we go to a chat board for other things, and we go to the New York Times for something else. It's not one-stop shopping.
I think Jeff's absolutely right about that. I think it's going to be different functions for different kinds of journalism, entities. But what I fear is that the one that's going to be the most popular and the one that's going to get the most advertising and the most viewers is going to be the one that basically abandons much of the verification process that journalism has traditionally had, and is not going to spend money on reporters, because basically, if you trust what the crowd says, then you don't really need it that much. I mean, the thing that troubles me is that we're living in a world that is also one of competing realities, and so what the truth is, what the truth about death panels is something that was very, very difficult to ascertain if you were depending on comments about it. I think that the role of the media that I want to see preserved, and it doesn't mean to the exclusion of the web as a culture of its own, just like television developed a culture of its own with its own values. The web culture is, speed is above accuracy, voice is above fairness, and entertainment is the key, is the chief value of all. I think that's the way the web will evolve in many ways, and there will be news entities on the web that will reflect those values, and to a certain extent, the mainstream media will as well. But I think you're going to have to, if you're running a news organization like Marty is, you have to make, trade-offs. If you're going to be fast, are you going to give up accuracy, and how are you going to sort of make that, make that conscious choice? I don't want that tension to go away entirely. I believe that it's important. I had a student who was a real enthusiast and passionate about the web, and Twitter was the thing that he was really looking forward to. This is before Twitter became this is a couple of years ago, and Twitter was really just beginning. And he sent me an email when he had read his first Twittered journalism online, and he found that he was absolutely thrilled by it because it was a story that was reported through Twitter of a reporter doing some piece of journalism as he was doing it and was tweeting about it as he was going along. And he sent me an email, and he was absolutely delighted. He said, now I feel like I'm really in the process. I feel like I really see what the reporter's seeing, and it doesn't have any of that bullshit of editors and fact-checking. Well, I mean, but he wasn't making a joke. I mean, he was basically, that's the way he looked at it. And I think that that's the way an increasing number of young people look at it. And I think maybe people generally. But I think that is not good enough as far as I'm concerned. I don't think that is a model that will lead us to have an informed population and except in a breaking news kind of, if you have a plane go down in the Hudson River, there's a great opportunity for, journalism by tweet. But if you're trying to do an investigation, or if you're trying to explain healthcare policy, or if you're trying to understand, nuances of politics and things like that, then you need something else. And if these news organizations, these institutions, for economic reasons, go dark effectively, I think that it's going to be a terrible, terrible loss. I don't think they ought to also turn themselves into something they are not in order to stay alive. I think that would be just as big a loss.
You have a comment in here in your book. You say, one of the endless arguments now taking place in journalism circles is about how to define what a journalist is. Anyone can write something and send it into the world, indeed send it around the world via the web, but is that journalism? Not to me, that's what you wrote. I think you've just answered that,
This is a
that question.
debate right now. It's the Shield Law. I mean, this is Congress is trying to figure out, what do we call a journalist?
Mm-hmm. Well, we can now take a page from your book, Jeff, and we're going to crowdsource.
Before we leave this, I don't want us to leave on such a pessimistic kind of note.
We're not going to leave, we'll just hear from the crowd.
I feel like it's like, I don't feel that way. I think that there is a great deal of passion in news organizations. I think there are an enormous number of young people who are really excited about journalism and want to use the power of the web. And online journalism can be extraordinarily powerful. It can be, breathtaking in some of the things that it can do. And I think that's something that the established news organizations need to incorporate. And I think that if the economy improves, because honestly, I believe that what's happened to the newspaper business, especially in this terrible economic downturn, has been a blessing. Because it's put organizations like the Boston Globe that had lifetime job guarantees for ad salesmen who had been selling ads since the 1970s and 80s, and those days are gone. And the thing is, the world that many newspapers were formed in has changed. They have now become much, much more efficient, much smaller, and the price of that has been that the news organization's news gathering power has been shrunk, and that needs to be rebuilt. And I think it can be rebuilt if there is the will to do it. And I think that there may well be, with the economy turning, some of the advertising revenues and other revenues and some of the changes in the way online revenue is generated, those are going to be opportunities to keep these journalism enterprises alive. And I hope very much that that's what's going to happen.
Good. We haven't discussed business models, which you're just touching on here, which I think gets to one of the central questions. Perhaps someone in the audience will address it also, is one of the things that enabled the Boston Globe to do what it has done, and news organizations that have had power over the years to do what they did, is they had economic strength so that they could have the courage to go out there. They could deal with a major multi-million-dollar lawsuit, for instance, after doing a $1 million investigation. I think that's a question that we really haven't touched tonight, is whether something in a crowdsourced report or citizen journalism, whether that is something we'll just completely lose. I don't know of a blogger that could, maybe Arianna Huffington, who could sustain a multi-million-dollar lawsuit or would even risk that sort of thing. So, Jeff, you have to take a shot at that, and then I'm going to turn to the audience.
Yeah, I don't know what to say, except I'm as worried as Alex. I mean, I see I agree that I mean, especially, I guess, speaking as the low man on the totem pole, just the writer, we, however much the world has changed, we still rely greatly on the institutional support of I've been with Wired 10 years. I mean, I don't see right now what makes up for that gap. That's why we're all here and terrified.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, we're going to crowdsource the rest of the evening here. I'm going to turn to you on this. Three things. When you are called upon, please identify yourself and your association. We ask that you have one brief question, that you not make speeches, and most important, that all of your questions end with a question mark. So with that, but I would recognize the gentleman up there as a distinguished.
I wondered if I could bring the panel into a related but important part of the conversation. The heart of this is about whether we can have an informed civil discourse in the country about matters, public matters. Rush Limbaugh now has an audience that's bigger than NPR, and I think bigger than the New York Times by some distance. We have various other voices out there now that are driving the discourse to an extraordinary degree, and I think that whether it be the death panels or birthing or whatever you would like, and it also has a quality that has been of great concern to the White House. How you all are very at the heart of journalism, mostly print journalism. Tell us about your level of concern about the overall quality of discourse that's being increasingly driven by fairly extreme voices, and so that of an evening, newscasts are being replaced by opinion to a large extent, and so that Bill O'Reilly, for example, said last week here in Boston that by early evening, people have the news. They're no longer interested in the news. What they're interested in is opinion, and it's antiquated to think that they're going to listen to somebody like an anchor, as Robin said, deliver the news anymore. What they want is a good fight.
You want to take a shot at that, Robin?
I mean, I think that we're in a world where there are so many choices. There are so many places you can go to hear what you want. And I'm always heartened by the fact that there are a lot of people who don't like how unruly television has become, or some of this opinion is something they don't like. They do have big numbers in their audiences, though. It's not something that I at ABC or what we do, we don't feel any pressure to move in that direction. And it'll be interesting to see what happens to it, but I don't feel any pressure to go in that way.
I've come to the conclusion, David, that what happens on especially cable news in the evening is now entertainment. It's not news at all. I mean, it's a kind of reality show, but with the sort of the image of discussion of policy, but in fact is an entertainment programming, and that's why I believe CNN, for instance, is not doing as well, because it still is more of a news format in the prime time. But the fact is that news has never won in prime time. That's why the news is on at 6:30 and then at 11, and prime time is given over to entertainment. I think that Rush Limbaugh falls into that same category. My point is not that they're not powerful and are not driving a lot of the national debate, but I think that people tend to distinguish between what they do, If they reinforce exactly what you think, then maybe you are, an acolyte and treat them and believe that they are genuinely delivering you sound news and analysis. But I think for the most part, it's the fight that the people are tuning in for. And that's not the same thing. I believe that's one of the reasons I feel like it would be a terrible mistake to abandon the standard of objective news. I believe it was not the conversation online and the conversation on cable news and Rush Limbaugh and his ilk that changed people's minds about the Iraq War. If you recall, when we went into Iraq, it was a very popular war, and there were an awful lot of people who believed in it, and I believed that the administration was telling us the truth about it. And over time, that changed. Well, that didn't change because of what people were saying in the sort of the conversation about it. It changed because no matter what people thought about the media, the fact was that they came to believe that the truth lay mostly with what the New York Times and other news organizations that were sending reporters to Iraq and reporting back what they saw and what the reality was there. That basically people came to embrace as something that was closer to what the truth was than what they had been told. And therefore they changed their attitudes about the war. I think if you give up the power of reporting, and especially the power of what is perceived to be objective reporting that is not trying to cook the books, then the power to persuade that journalism is going to have is going to be greatly diminished, because the people who will are inclined to believe one thing or another will simply choose the voices that reinforce that for the most part, or maybe they want to be entertained by the fight. But if they're going to change their minds, if they're going to have their minds changed, then it's going to be on the basis of reporting. So I think that that is the reality of the way our country still works, and I hope it will continue to.
Well, I'll just very quickly. I agree with Alex's prescription. I would dissent on the analysis. I think that a lot of people in the public, not everybody, have lost the capacity to distinguish between what is entertainment and what is news. And I think they see Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh and Keith Olbermann on the other side of the political spectrum, not just as entertainers, but in fact as providers of the news. Now, Bill O'Reilly can come here and say they already have the news and that I'm a part of the fight. But I think that's a false distinction. I think that a lot of people turn into Bill O'Reilly because they think he is delivering the news, and they think that Rush Limbaugh is delivering the news. And on the issue of trust, which was brought up earlier, trust being the new black, as someone said, I think there's a problem there too, because it's an assumption that people will trust in news that's presented within our concept of what constitutes objectivity, accuracy, honesty, fairness, things like that. But I think increasingly people are trusting providers of news and information and commentary who affirm their pre-existing points of view. And I think that's a pronounced trend in the media today. I think it'll become even more pronounced over time, and that we are over time in many ways sort of going back to the era of pamphleteers in the early chapters of the press in this country.
But people did change their minds about, for instance, health care reform.
Sure, it takes a while. I mean, yes, it can happen.
And they did it because of reporting, not
yes,
because
but you can also look at how many people still believe that Saddam Hussein was responsible for the attacks of 9/11, and they'll believe that no matter what.
I know.
Or they believe that Israel did it, or the Jews did it, or the U.S. government did it, or someone did it, but except for the people who did it. And that's approximately 1/3 of the American public, no matter what.
Yes.
My name is Jennifer Donahue, and I was a fellow here at the IOP last year. And my question really is for any of you, and related to David Gergen's observation that I'm also concerned about the civic discourse in journalism. And I also, among other things, go on TV with David and fight because they like to fight, but we fight in a civic way. And there's a difference between the discussion we might have on CNN and the one that might occur, I think, at a different time with a more opinionated anchor than, say, Anderson Cooper or something. But my question is more about the blogosphere, which I think is the part of the web that decided that it wants to just slam professional journalism, and how that affects you all, or how you might feel about Chuck Todd becomes White House correspondent for MSNBC and NBC, and suddenly there's a chain of 1,000 people personally attacking him. Or David Gregory begins to host Meet the Press, and suddenly he's attacked for his credibility by people who have no credibility. And what concerns me about the blending, Jeff, as you were talking about, between sort of regular people's comments and their interest in news is, should they be providing sources? Should they be saying who they are? Should their opinions be transparent? It seems like an unlevel playing field that is actually taking some credible journalists and slandering their reputations to some extent. And I'm curious what your thoughts or concerns about that may be.
On what exactly? Just on that. Let me
On
focus
whether
on.
that,
Let me
well,
focus
it
on
concerns
blogosphere.
me as someone who's a contributor for the Huffington Post.
Yeah.
That when I write about a factual aspect to the Clarence Thomas hearings, or I write about a factual connection between the House banking scandal in 1992 that I covered then, and people reading it don't know about that, and I explain it, that their first response is, what is she talking about? There seems to be that a lot of mechanisms that should be okay, like Huffington Post, are now actually a back and forth between journalists and people who resent the field of journalism. And I'm curious if you perceive that, or if that concerns you as we dumb down our civic discourse.
Well, two things concern me. The vitriol against professional journalists, and the reaction that journalists have had. There was a Pew study that got a lot of attention this year that showed that something like 1/3 of respondents would care if their local paper shut down. But what I actually found interesting that no one talked about was that the number, of course, was much higher amongst regular readers, i.e. subscribers, but it was only 55%. And so I really think that journalists have to, on one hand, separate out the less substantive vitriol expressed against them. This has always been an aspect online, and as I said earlier, often it's kids. People don't know this, but we at Wired do. A lot of this stuff that you're all so worried about, it's written by 12-year-olds. No, it really is. But some of it is really substantive, and journalists and journalists need to engage, I think, in a reckoning and say, well, our customers, and they are that, if 45% of our paying customers are unhappy, we need to look at why that is. So, we can bemoan this hatred for MSM, for the mainstream media, but we need to, in a cold, calculated, pragmatic way, look at what the source of it.
But you also genuinely have to be very thick-skinned to do this now. If you read, read the Post, you really do. I remember one time I went on O'Reilly to explain why I thought that it made sense for Americans to understand Islam, which he thought was a bad idea. And I remember I got the favor. I'm sure that everyone up here has gotten emails and letters that would, that are astonishing. I showed one of mine to a colleague here, and he asked me if I had contacted the police for safety's sake. But my favorite was one I got from San Bernardino, California. And it was in an envelope, and on the return address on the envelope on the upper left-hand corner was the organization's name that had sent it. And it was Citizens for Deporting Alex Jones. So I felt like I had stirred civic engagement,
Maybe in television we have a little bit of a thicker skin because people use the snail mail for years to send hate mail when they felt like they could connect with a television personality. Ted Koppel used to have a door plastered with the hate mail he had received. But I remember right after 9/11 was when we were first really getting the feedback from online people and getting emails in a way that we hadn't before. And it was, I can remember talking to Sam Donaldson about how shocking it was to him how offensive people could be and how personally they attacked him. Now, as the years have gone by, we are more aware that online you get more of that. That's just more of an accepted behavior on there. But I am also working with George Stephanopoulos now, who gets a lot of email and who gets a lot, has his own blog. He's the #1 journalist tweeter in the world, I think. And to listen and to go back and forth with him on that, it's just very interesting to me how much engaging with that audience has sort of helped him grow as a person and understand what those people are feeling. It helps make him a better journalist, but it also helps him head toward where his show is going, what we're doing with it in a healthy way. And we can track on our website, obviously in ways we couldn't on television. What are people following? What do they go to? And it's, yes, they want Balloon Boy. Yes, they want to know who the father is of Michael Jackson's children and all of those stories. But they also will go, George's blog is the #1 blog on our site. And that is a wonky, politics, serious blog, but from a trusted person. And people do want some of that incremental information from him. And he is a trusted source, and it is reported. It's not, the plane landing in the Hudson. So, there are some good signs out there, too, that people are growing into it, as you said before, in ways we're all, as a country, sort of learning how to use those things and what we don't like. And I think some of this ugly discourse, a lot of people in the country don't like. There are going to be a fair number of people who are always there. Maybe it's your 30%, maybe it's lower.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for a lively discussion. My name is Hani Moafi. I'm faculty member at Boston University. I just want to step back for a second because I'm a little bit concerned that the panel, in discussing the news that we're losing, is presenting only the best of the news that we're losing. And I think that there is a tradition of tremendous investigative reporting out of all of the organizations that you guys are affiliated with. However, I think there also have been some spectacular oversights, missteps, stories that did not get adequately reported until way after the fact, including the run-up to the Iraq War. And when you say all the news that's fit to print, by definition, you're saying if it's excluded from the news that was printed, then it wasn't really news. And I, for one, am very excited about the potential for crowdsourcing, not to provide the very best information, but to provide more voices into the mix. And I'm curious what the panel thinks about, in looking at the future of the news, the model of not necessarily being first, but as the Boston Globe did with the story that was previously reported in the Phoenix, searching for what's out there, utilizing information that's coming into you, and then really investing the resources to see, is this a real story? What are the other elements of the story? And how can that become the trusted repository for more investigation of all this other information that's out there?
It sounds like journalism to me, but Marty?
Okay, well, it wasn't all previously reported in the Phoenix, so let me just get that out of the way. That's just not true. So in any event, I think I'm very encouraged by the opportunity for all sorts of people to get in and do the stories that the traditional press has missed. There is absolutely no question that mainstream news organizations have missed major stories or misfired on major stories. And that's our failure. And the fact is that we're an imperfect institution. No question about it. We're imperfect, just like every other profession. So there's no reason that anybody should expect that we should be perfect, whereas all other institutions in society can be imperfect. So we're imperfect. So to the extent that new technologies allow other people to get in, I'm all in favor of that. The question is, what are they getting in with? Now, if people want to go do real reporting, verify facts, go out in the field, let's say go to Iraq, or talk to primary sources, or look at primary documents, or anything of that sort, I'm completely in favor of it. And right now, there's a zero cost of entry into our business. Anybody can set up a website, A 12-year-old can be an international television network overnight by just using the little camera on their computer, and they're an international television network. So congratulations. The question is, what do you do with that power? Do you just offer your opinions, or do you actually do some real reporting? And to the extent that newcomers into the field are actually getting into the real field and doing original, verifiable reporting, I'm completely in favor of that. I think that's a fabulous outcome of new technologies.
What I'm really asking is
Go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry. To be clear, what I'm really asking is whether there's a model for respected news organizations now to kind of have their antennas out, listening for all this information that's coming from other people. I'm not equating that with journalism. I'm saying, yeah, that to use your antennas to hear all of that, and then invest in the investigation of things that you find.
I think that that's
value.
something that virtually every news organization is doing. And I think that the difficulty is finding those people who can do it in a way that will, make it work right.
The trick
on the
is,
basis that Marty had.
well, as Robin mentioned, they're using that. Stephanopoulos is using that. All of our news organizations are using that. It's very difficult, though. I mean, just with our organization, we have comments too. Some of them are written by 12-year-olds. Some of them are written by 30-year-olds who act like 12-year-olds. So, but there are thousands upon thousands of comments every day, maybe 10,000 comments a day. I had a reader just recently who suggested we pour through all those comments, that people were making allegations of wrongdoing on the part of public officials, and that we should go investigate every single one of those. Well, that would tie up probably a dozen reporters a day just to try to chase those things down. To achieve the level of verification, the level of documentation, to put anything like that in a newspaper or online is extraordinary, and people don't have an appreciation of how much is required before publication for an organization like ours, or any respectable organization. But we can still use what people are submitting to us. They can even send us just regular emails. That would work too. It doesn't have to be in the comments portion of the site. But we do monitor those things. We do look for things that people have suggested, and we actually monitor what people are twittering as well. So when there's for example, just in the case of pretty mundane example, but in the case of an accident on the MBTA, when people are sending out tweets, we monitor those, and they contain information, and then we go pursue them, and we actually verify them, and then we use them.
Thank you. Yes, sir. There.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here. My name's David Hafferty. I'm a freshman at the college here. And I was wondering what the panel believed the government should be, what role it should play, if any, in the future of the news.
The role the government should play in the future of news, are you talking about should the government subsidize news, or
yes.
in there?
I think that that's becoming an issue that a lot of people are thinking hard about, because this is a commercial enterprise with a public good, and if the commercial enterprise is no longer going to generate the public good, will there be, a role for government? Personally, I think that the government's role would need to be done in a very sort of indirect way. I think that the idea that the government would step in and offer to pay the salaries of reporters at the Boston Globe, I don't think that's going to happen. But I think that the government can be very helpful in all kinds of ways. One in particular, the thing that has kept newspapers afloat in many respects during these past months has been the requirement that legal notices be published in a paid circulation newspaper in the community. Now, all this stuff could be published online very easily, even better probably. But the only ad category that has grown in the last several months has been the area of these public notices, a lot of them foreclosure notices. There's an effort to strip that from newspapers and news organizations and allow municipalities who don't want to pay the price from their public coffers to be able to publish it for nothing online. If that happens, then one of the few remaining revenue sources that is effectively a government source of revenue would go away. That would be very damaging. I don't know how much the Boston Globe takes in every year in public, I mean, this year particularly in legal notices, but I bet it was a lot. That's the kind of thing that I think government could do. I think that if they take that away, it will be a real body blow to journalism. But they're already doing that, so government is helping.
Just as one journalist, I'm opposed to government subsidizing news coverage. Certainly it does it to some extent with PBS and NPR and things like that, and I think that's fine. But frankly, and they all do good work, but the work of those organizations is highly dependent and highly derivative of the work that's done by newspapers. If you listen to NPR or WBUR, you'll hear that a lot of the work that they do is they're talking to reporters at the New York Times, or they're talking to reporters or using the reports of people at the Boston Globe. What you don't find from those publicly supported news organizations is true, adventurous, original, investigative reporting that is holding government accountable, with rare exception, the most notable exception being Frontline, as far as I know. But it's very rare, and it just doesn't happen. And I think one reason it does, there are several reasons probably why it doesn't happen. One is that those organizations, despite their public support, they don't have enough in the way of resources to do those sorts of investigations. How much time are you going to invest in a long investigation for a 2-minute report on radio? So there's a question there. But the other reason, I think, is perhaps unconscious, and that is to the extent that those news organizations really challenge government, question in some ways maybe even the legitimacy of government or the honesty of government, and that they really hold them accountable, they put their own resources at risk every time they do that. And that's the definition of a conflict of interest. And I think that's a problem. And we have to, I'm as concerned as anyone, maybe more concerned given what I've gone through the last year, over the future of journalism. But I hope that the answer is not to turn to the government for help. I think that we have to search for a new business model, and that's what we're doing. It's not easy to do. There are a lot of pundits who think they have the answer. My only question is why they haven't gone to venture capitalists to fund those answers. And the answer is because they don't have the answer. So we're all still working on that. But I don't think that the answer is to turn to the federal government or even to local government for a handout.
We have time for maybe 2 quick ones. Yes, sir.
Mine is very quick because it's fact-oriented. Can any of you
Identify
name...
yourself, please.
I'm William Gray. I'm a student and journalist in the off hours. Can any of you name a broadcast, print, or online network that's journalistically oriented that has neither cut its staff nor lost revenue or budget in the past, let's say, 3 years?
Yeah. Bloomberg.
Bloomberg.
They're expanding. And they're expanding from business into politics, and they've got lots of money, and it's, run by the guy who, not run, but owned by the guy who's as deep into politics as is imaginable. So go figure.
I would also mention all the newcomers onto the scene. Huffington Post was mentioned. Politico in San Diego. There's something called, I think it's San Diego Online. So there are all sorts of new ventures out there, and I think that's exciting.
Those are nonprofits for the most part. I don't know, Huffington Post isn't.
Well, Politico's not.
Politico's not, but I think that San Diego is.
Huffington Post is not nonprofit,
No,
although
no,
they don't have any profits. But they're not officially a nonprofit.
And Global Post is also trying.
We're not officially a nonprofit either, so.
But the thing is, Bloomberg is extraordinarily profitable. So by the light, the real dazzling performer in these past, months and years has been Bloomberg News.
Can I just have an addendum on that? I don't think their profits are from their news coverage. Their profits are from providing machines to financial organizations. And I think that to some extent their success in their business-to-business business is masks what's really happening on their news side. They've been able to, because of their success in that area, they've been able to subsidize their news operations, as far as I know.
True. I wouldn't argue. Look at the Washington Post, though.
Right.
Right, with Kaplan. Yes. Yes, and yours will be the last question.
Hi, my name is Carolyn McGordy, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And prior to coming here, I was at ABC News for 4 years, where I worked for World News with Charles Gibson. And so I had a question for Robin, because I think that we succeed very well in covering issues for television, but I have a question about the editorial strategy of our website, abcnews.com. Right now, the homepage headlines read everything from Afghan elections to a kitten stuck in a car engine. So I'm wondering, how much of a factor do clicks determine what ends up on the homepage?
I would say it's so interesting to be able to get the kind of research you can from these websites. It's fascinating to all of us. And there are days when it's certainly the kitten or the balloon boy or something that is leading in clicks, what's on the home. And that does, that does inform the decision of those who will look at it the next hour to see what's important. But also, we've gotten, really, we get great numbers on hard news stories too. I mean, it depends on the story, it depends on the day. The death panels, there was tremendous interest in what was going on at those town hall meetings and some other things. So I think, and we've invested a lot in the political side of it, because that gets a lot of numbers. That drives a lot of traffic onto the site. And a lot of people, you're focused on the home page, but I would say sometimes it's more than half of the people come into the site through a side door, from a link from some story they were interested in from some other aggregator or somebody else. So it's not always what's on the home page that's driving that traffic. But it's a mix.
But I guess if you're trying to attract the younger generation, is there some sort of editorial strategy that you think will gear us towards abcnews.com if we want to get our information from that website?
The editorial strategy is to just keep throwing things out there and see what's going to take us to that new business model, so we can keep doing everything we do. Is there something, what did you ask, what you can do?
I mean, if you're trying to get the younger generation to come to ABC News as a news source, do you have some sort of editorial vision that would make us want to come there to get our information?
Only excellence in everything we do, and to figure out if there are things like the Brian Ross part of that, the investigative. We've definitely decided that there are areas that we can own or at least excel in, and I think that is one of them, and the political side is one area, and law and justice. So we're picking things that we get a lot of feedback on, and we think we can go deep and be excellent in.
I don't know the extent to which that most email box is synonymous with a younger demographic, but for my book, I tried to quantify the most emailed stories on the New York Times site for several weeks, and I just followed it. And it was really surprising. I'm not telling the story quite right. I'm friends with someone who's been there for years, and I'd asked him, to what extent are you changing your editorial policy to drive, are reporters trying to get up on there? Like, is it, what kind of stories are they doing? And he said, not really, because you'll be surprised. Look, and it's mostly spinach. It's mostly, the hard news and long series that you would think would not draw viewers or readers, but it really does. And my little study bore that out.
And I would say just one more thing, that the internal pressure now to be somebody who gets the most emails or the most emailed story, it's really kind of getting exciting and very funny some days too. My blog is bigger than your blog.
Thank you. Well, I think the question, though, is whether that's, you use the word the spinach, that's your iron core, I suppose. It's that really substantive kind of reporting that for so long, particularly in newspapers, it was subsidized in a way by the crossword puzzle and the comics and the sports reporting and so forth. And as that gets stripped away, is there a business model that will support the iron core, support the spinach?
Well, I think, in my opinion, it's going to be a combination of things. It's going to be the business that has been a traditional business in the sense that it's going to be driven by advertising sales, either online or print or both. It's going to be contributions from readers. It's going to be contributions from nonprofits and investigative journalism organizations and outfits like Global Post. It's going to be perhaps some subsidized journalists' beats that are going to be funded by local foundations for a while. It's going to be a mix-up. It's going to be a whole host of things. It's going to be new kinds of online advertising. It's going to be perhaps search. It may be, if they find a way to make it possible to make it stick. Newsday has now announced that it's going to start charging. It's the biggest newspaper to take that chance. If they get clobbered financially, I think that will be a significant thing. But they are stepping off that plank, and I don't really know how that's going to work. I think it's going to be a very intensely watched process, though, because they are basically saying we're going to be the first to find out whether it helps us or hurts us more to charge for our online access. I think that it's going to be a mixed bag, though, and I think that a mixed bag is okay, because it's going to be a stripped-down version of the newspaper business and the mainstream news media business that existed in the 80s and 90s, and that's okay. But it needs not to go away, and the institutions and the standards and the values need not to go away.
Thank you. Well, his book, Losing the News, and we'll see. It's an interesting time to be in. I want to thank the panelists, Marty Barron, editor of the Boston Globe, Robin Sproul, the Washington Bureau Chief of ABC News, and Jeff Howe of Wired Magazine, and a Neiman Fellow here, and of course, Alex Jones, the director of the Neiman Center. Thank you, and thank the audience for your contribution. Appreciate that. And everyone is welcome to the book signing party over on the 5th floor of the Taubman.
Book party, but
book party.
You have to, it's certainly not calculated to get you to buy books and have them
Oh,
signed.
okay.
But we would love to buy you a glass of wine up at the top of Taubman.
Yes. Thank you again. Thanks for coming.